Jamie Strange with the USDA Bee Lab in Logan, Utah. He specializes in research on bumblebees, leaf-cutting bees, and blue orchard bees.
So the program says I'm supposed to start at 7 and go to 7:45. Is that right? So I'm going to go to 7:45 because they gave me extra time because they all know how much I like to talk. No, I won't. I'll try to give some of my extra time away.
We'll have plenty of time for questions.
Yeah. All right, so I'm going to talk about, this is the title I think Joey sent me a brief thing saying, why don't you talk about bumblebees in Utah agricultural and wild lands? And I said, great, I'll use that as the title. And then I'm off the hook. I don't have to claim any responsibility for what I talk about. So that's what I'm going to do today. Again, I'm Jamie Strange. I'm a research entomologist with the USDA Agricultural Research Service, so that's a federal agency. We're primarily the in-house research arm of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So when there's a question of national importance for agriculture, we're the ones who get to address that. And then my colleague and boss, Diana Cox-Foster, is here, and she's going to talk next. So she can probably tell you a little bit more about what our lab does. But we are the pollinating insect biology management systematics research laboratory, which is a fancy way of saying we work on mostly native bees and pretty much the 19,999 species of bees which are not honeybees. So we get a lot of stuff to work on, and it turns out we actually do some work with honeybees, and I'll talk about that as well as I'm going forward. But this is a map, this little thing in the corner. You saw one, Joey had one up earlier. It's sort of a heat map, this thing down here, of the United States. So that's the United States. And the hotter colors, the way to read these things is that the hotter colors, the reds and the oranges, are higher densities of different kinds of bees. So we're talking about different species. I just said about 20,000. I could sing. I was thinking about that for a second. I'm like, so where it's really dark red, a lot of species, a lot of diversity. And where it's these sort of greens and yellows, less diversity. And so what you'll notice is I drew a box around southern Utah here, because southern Utah is particularly diverse in different kinds of bees. In fact, southern Utah is about Utah as a whole has about 1,200 different species of bees, which is kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. But this area in southern Utah is about 800 different species in itself, and that's about the same as the eastern United States, east of the Mississippi. So this is a great place to study bees if you're interested in bees that are not honeybees, and if you're interested in bees that are honeybees, it's also a great place to work with and study honeybees, because we've got a lot of those here too. So it really works out for those of us who have devoted our lives to getting stung. So in Utah, we have 21 species of bumblebees. I've been asked this question for the last 11 years since I've been working with bumblebees. And today, I actually sat down and came up with the answer by counting. And I'm probably wrong, because this year, the spring of 2017, we had a specimen that somebody asked us to identify from the La Salle Mountains. And it was a species of bumblebee which had never been recorded in this state. It had been recorded in Colorado. It had been recorded in California. But this is the first time we found it in Utah. So who knows, next year, maybe we're at 22. But it'll probably be more than just 1 year before that happens. So here's the list. These are the specific names. So bumblebees are in a genus. And a genus is a group of closely related organisms, right? So the genus bumblebees are in is called Bombus. That's the scientific name. And that's Latin for loud or boisterous. Which is kind of, you think about bumblebees, they're kind of loud and boisterous when they fly by you. And then these are the specific names, so mixtus, huntii, and these are all Latinized in some way. so that you can see pensylvanicus. And I'm going to go through some of these, and we're going to see some pictures and some other things related to that, because what I kind of want to give you is this sense of the diversity of this genus in this state. And we're going to see some pretty pictures, and then I'll talk about where these bees are located and where you might see them. And then I'm going to spend this sort of second half of my time talking about an experiment we've been doing in Mona at this big tomato production facility, and how we're looking at transfer of disease from these native bees into honeybees, or from honeybees into the native bees, and how that flow of pathogens might happen back and forth. So, and these, I wanted to point out, these 4 bottom ones, bumblebees are really interesting. We've got 21 species, and 4 of them are exclusively parasitic on the other species. So a queen insularis is known to parasitize nests of this Bombus huntii. So the queen will go in, she'll kill the queen that's in there and take over the nest, and she uses all the workers in that nest to rear her own offspring. So these 4 species here do that, and a lot of people are like, oh, we hate those, we should kill them, but I actually think these are pretty spectacularly interesting as far as their biology and their ability to co-opt another colony and do that. And sort of in the large population community cycle of bees, it's not really a bad thing to have something that keeps your populations in check. So this is nature's way of doing it for bumblebees, at least some bumblebees, is by having these really interesting nest parasites. So we're going to go through alphabetically by Latin name, because that's how I think. This is Bombus appositus, this big beauty. You'll see these they have really large queens, and you'll see them in the spring. Here's a map of Utah. All my slides of these bees are going to be set up about the same. Here's the common name up top, the white-shouldered bumblebee, the map of Utah in the bottom left for you. The shaded area is the area where I totally came up with this myself by looking at maps and saying, it's about this, and then drawing a line around it. So don't expect that necessarily all the little nooks and crannies around the edges are exactly the range of this bee, but this is approximately the area in the state where you'll find it. And then these little icons over here on the right, if it's forested, you'll find it in wildlands, or primarily mountains, places where there are trees growing. Mountains or canyons, I should say. And then tractor, of course, things you'll find in ag fields, frequently associated with production. And then this little city down here is telling you that it's something you would likely run into in town if you have plantings around, or a garden or something like that, plantings around buildings, you would see those. Whoa, got excited there. So this is the white-shouldered bumblebee, as I said before. It's fairly common. It's pretty diagnostic by being large, mostly this sort of yellowish orange, and then having this really white-colored face and shoulders, if you will, right ahead of the wings. Very ubiquitous bee in Utah. Certainly in northern Utah, you see it pretty much all over the place. You won't find it in the hottest sort of lowland areas, but it does frequent ag fields. And if you're up in the mountains, one thing to look for would be to look for this bee on things like monkshood or larkspur. It really likes plants in that family, so it tends to almost specialize on them, which is unusual for bumblebees. But this is the high country bumblebee. This is the one we found just this last year in Utah. So this is restricted just to the LaSalle Mountains. There's a little dot over here, approximately covering the mountains. So Jerry, if you go back to Moab and there's a big blue dot on the mountains, that's my fault. I put it there today. But yeah, you'll find it only in the highest country. So we didn't think it was in Utah. We thought it was only in Colorado, and then it also occurs in the high Sierras, and then not again until you get into the northern Rockies up in Montana. But our first ones this year in Utah, so that was pretty exciting for us. This is one of the most common bumblebees you will see in this state, certainly in the northern half of the state. It's Bombus bifarius, or the two-formed bumblebee. We call it two-formed because it has this little individual here, which is black here on the abdomen. But the one that's more common in Utah is one with a red abdomen. And the further south you go, the brighter that red is. So in northern Utah, this is kind of a black and red mix, but once you get down into the Escalante area, they're bright red. And then here's the map. It kind of runs down the spine of the state. In the higher elevations, it tends to be, but we do find it, at least in the north, in ag fields quite frequently, and it's a very common visitor to your garden. So keep your eye out for this one. The diagnostic character on this is this little V of black that occurs at the back of the thorax. So there we go. Bombus californicus, the California bumblebee. Some of these names are easy. I can speak Latin, californicus. This is definitely a forest bee. We typically find it in the mountains or the canyons. Rarely do we find it in Cache Valley in the ag field. Sometimes it'll pop down, but generally higher elevation sites, but mostly throughout the state, at least as long as it's a high elevation site, it does pretty well. This has a big lump of pollen on its back. Does anybody know what this plant is? Butter and eggs? Okay, butter and eggs is an invasive weed. Yeah, so bumblebees like invasive weeds. But this is it puts its pollen on the back of the thorax, and it's well adapted to bumblebees, this plant, in its native Eurasian distribution. And so drops that pollen on the back, and when the bee goes into the next flower, because it can't scrape it off while it's out in the field, it pollinates the flower just by passing through, and it gets more pollen stuck on it. It's a clever little system. And there's also bumblebees that have figured out that they don't like to get their backs all smeared up with pollen, so they'll climb underneath the flower and bite a hole in it, and they'll nectar rob, much like honeybees will do with alfalfa. This is Bombus centralis, the central bumblebee. Again, some easy Latin there for you. It's sort of diagnostic with this orange tip to the abdomen, and the rest is primarily yellow with a pretty distinct black band between the wings. This one's flying, so it's a little fuzzy, but widely distributed throughout the state. Again, very common in mountains and canyons. Mostly, we typically don't see this above about 7,000 feet or so, 8,000 feet in the north. As you go further south, it sort of climbs up higher on the mountain. So you might find it up high in the southern half of the state. But definitely very common in canyons. This loves going, if you're up in a canyon in the spring and you see the water leaf, hydrophyllum, it's a small little plant, grows really close to the ground with a ball of purple flowers. These guys are all over that. They love that plant. So keep your eyes out for that one. Again, they like places where it's forested. In the northern half of the state, they will definitely be in ag fields a lot. These are very common. And we see them around town all the time. This is the yellow bumblebee, Bombus fervidus. As you can see, it's yellow. It's got this diagnostic black head and a black band between its wings. Found throughout the state. It does not typically get into the mountains very much. You'll find it at the sort of mouths of canyons a little bit, but it really loves ag fields. And you see a lot of these in midsummer. And they tend to be very large-bodied and robust, so people see them, and they quickly identify them and say, ah, and run away, because they are also a little bit fierce. So these are one of those bumblebees where most people are like, bumblebees are nice and friendly, but don't try to pet this one. She'll get annoyed. And we find them in town a lot. They do very well around people. Interestingly, most bumblebees nest in the ground in rodent burrows, if you didn't know that. Some will nest in bird nests or tree cavities, although that's a much less common habit. These ones actually nest in clumps of grass on the soil surface. So sometimes people will dig them up in compost piles and stuff like that. They're one of the species that does that. The yellowhead bumblebee, this is extremely uncommon in Utah, unless you're in the high Uintas, where you'll find them. But otherwise, you have to get up near Park City, Guardsman Pass, that area. We get a few up in the mountains in Cache County, but not too many. And they kind of peter out as you head south. But they're definitely a forest kind of bee. This is Bombus griseicollis. This is one that pretty much all of you have probably run into in your garden. Another one that loves to make nests in compost piles, especially where people pile grass clippings. So if you mow your lawn and you dump your grass clippings in the same spot, eventually you will get a nest of these there. They seem to prefer that over all other nesting sites that I can figure out. And again, found throughout the state. And mostly, they pretty much stay out of the mountains, so they're mostly in the agricultural and urban areas. We will find them out in the sort of sagebrush wildlands as well. This is Bombus huntii. This is one of my favorite bees because it kind of pays my bills. It's found throughout the state. It's distributed pretty broadly. It's one of the more common bees. It's one that in my lab, I've got a number of students working with me, and one of the big projects we have is trying to get this into domestication for greenhouse pollination. So you'll occasionally, if you see a bunch of people running around the edge of a field or the mouth of a canyon in the spring, waving insect nets and screaming, "I got one," it could be one of my students out collecting queen bumblebees to get them nesting in the lab. Again, this sort of bright orange abdomen as the diagnostic, and then a distinct clear band between the wing bases. This is the fuzzy horn bumblebee. We call it fuzzy horn bumblebee because the males in this species are one of the few bumblebees that have hair on their antennae. So it seemed like a good name. Again, restricted to high elevations. We don't find these much throughout the state. Just there's La Salle's, and then up here in the Uintas, and then in Cache Valley, and well, really from Park City north, we find them through the Wasatch, but only at the very highest of mountain meadows. This is Morrison's bumblebee. This is another one that you're going to find a lot in your gardens. You're going to find a lot in agricultural areas. It's widely distributed throughout the state. Again, but in low elevation sites. Rarely do you find it above. We'll find it only at the valley floor in Cache Valley, so 4,500 feet or so, up to maybe 5,500 feet. And beyond that, we don't see it. So as you go south, of course, it climbs up the mountains a little bit, but pretty low elevation bee. The black-tailed bumblebee, and so again, northern distribution, only really in the mountains, pretty uncommon. The Nevada bumblebee, which is not restricted to just Nevada, it comes into Utah. We see this a lot. Actually, this is throughout the West. This is one of the more common bees you'll find as far as distribution. It's all over the place. And from the tallest mountain peaks down to the valley floors and the busy cities, this bee does well pretty much everywhere. It's not super abundant in any one place, but they're really broadly distributed. This is the western bumblebee, Bombus occidentalis. Pretty big distribution throughout the state, from highest of the mountains to the lowest of the valleys. This is one species that there's a lot of interest in because it used to be incredibly common throughout the western U.S., and it's declined to become much less common. And so a lot of the work that my lab does is focused on this and focused on trying to figure out why this species and some other closely related species are disappearing from the West. So we're put a lot of energy into trying to save this bee, if you will. This is Bombus pensylvanicus, the Pennsylvania bumblebee, which is distributed, of course, not just in Pennsylvania, but from the northeastern U.S. the whole way down to central Mexico. Has a really broad distribution. These two yellow bands in the middle of the abdomen. And we only find it in Utah, interestingly, just on the eastern edge of the state, right there. And once you get into Colorado, it becomes much more common, but in Utah, it's not so common there. Although probably the best places for this one, like downtown Moab this year, I was down there this summer, and there were a ton of them just kind of flying around downtown. So that made me think, wow, this is really pretty good habitat here. In some pollinator gardens people have planted, so it was really nice. And again, throughout its range, these occur in ag fields. This is kind of a clover specialist. So if you have red clover in a field, this is one you might see that would come in and pollinate that red clover. This is Bombus rufocinctus, red belted. Again, red bands here on the abdomen. Interestingly, with this species, there's a lot of variation, and there are about half of the individuals of this species don't have the red bands. They're black on the abdomen, and so the name will throw you off. It has a really broad distribution, and it's something you probably see in your gardens as well. Bombus sylvicola, the forest bumblebee, again restricted to really high elevation sites. and pretty uncommon everywhere in the state. There's a few spots where you find them, but they're not seen a lot. And then finally, this is one of those parasites I was talking about, Bombus insularis, or the insular bumblebee, distributed throughout the state. It's actually very common throughout the western US. And pretty much anywhere you are, this bee will be there. As long as there's other bumblebees for it to parasitize, it will show up. So that's the whole walk through the bumblebees of Utah. You've now seen pretty much all of them. So when I quiz you later, you will be able to tell me what bee you're looking at. I would encourage you, if you're interested in bumblebee identification, there's this handy dandy guide that this is the Bumblebees of the Western United States. It's a Forest Service publication. Grad student of mine, John Koch, and I and our colleague Paul Williams put this together a few years ago. You can get this if you go to pollinator.org, which is the Pollinator Protection Campaign. You can buy these for $10. I don't get a cent of it. All the money goes back to pollinator protection. So go for it. Go buy this and support bees if you want to. And it's got a guide similar to what I just showed you up there with pictures and some other information. So nice and handy little thing. I think they're $10 each currently. There's also, if you really want to geek out, there's a book which is relatively new called The Bumblebees of North America. And this has not just the western bees, but bees from all over the country. And it talks about sort of their life history and a lot of details. It's came out a couple of years ago. And out on the table out there, I put some little cards. So if you're really into it, you can go grab one of these cards. It's got the information about the authors and stuff on the back. And you can just take that to remind yourself that you want to put this on your Christmas list for your friends and family to buy for you. So Bumblebees of North America, really good book. And I didn't write that one, and I said it's a good book, so it must be good, right? The other one, it's great. It's the best book ever. And then finally, if you want to help the bumblebees or you're interested in learning more, you can go grab one of these cards. Also, there's a few out there. This is Bumblebee Watch. And so what this is it's a little app you can put on your smartphone. And when you're out in your garden picking your berries and you see a bumblebee on a flower, you snap a photo and you upload it. And then I or someone like me will go and identify that bee for you. So if we can, if your picture's good enough, we'll say, oh, that was Bombus huntii. Nice picture. So there's cards out there. If you're interested in doing this, don't feel obligated just because I'm up here telling you to do it. But we use all these records that people send on this Bumblebee Watch. We actually use it to track populations throughout the United States. So it becomes powerful if a lot of people contribute to it. So on second thought, you really should do it. Down in Mona at the Howling Greenhouse. And we had this idea. There's been some talk, some writing in the literature that commercial bumblebees, those that are raised in facilities and then sent out to pollinate tomatoes, are somehow full of diseases, and that they go out to the wild and they get put, or they go out to the greenhouse, they get put in the greenhouse, and then they fly out of the greenhouse and they spread disease to all the happy native bumblebees, which are of course never sick. And this is the story that is developed. And it's a nice story because we like to think that bees living in nature are happy and healthy and there aren't things that are killing them naturally, and that really it's industrial ag that's causing all the problems. This didn't sit well with me for a number of reasons, but primarily because it just didn't make any sense. If the bees raised in facilities were really that sick, wouldn't they all be dying before they got shipped out to the greenhouses? Is it really in the company who's producing the bees' best interest to sell really sick bees and ship them all over the place? So that was sort of the first thing that said, I'm not sure I buy this story. But there were a couple papers that had come out largely based on sort of correlation. So we look where there are commercial bees and we find disease. And when we look where there aren't commercial bees, well, we don't find disease, but we're only going to look at 2 or 3 spots. If we look too many spots, then it kind of messes up our story. So my postdoc, Amber Tripodi, and I decided we were gonna test this, and we decided at the same time that there was also a couple papers that had come out looking at honeybee apiaries, and this was work that was done in Great Britain, putting honeybee apiaries and collecting bumblebees around those, and showing that the bumblebees around the honeybee apiaries had higher incidence of viruses than those away from apiaries. And that was actually a much better done study. And there's some good reasons to think that might be true. And these are these are all papers that came out with various things saying that look, honeybees and bumblebees share viruses. Honeybees and bumblebees can transmit those viruses on flowers to each other. And that maybe there's these associations that are a threat to wild pollinators. And I said, well, that's fine. If they're a threat to wild pollinators, they may also be a threat to managed pollinators the other way, right? So if we're putting bees near each other and some of them have disease, it really doesn't matter if they're wild or managed. They pose a health risk to other bees. So shouldn't we know the rate at which these diseases spread in a community? Whether or not it's affecting your honeybees or my bumblebees or the commercial guys' bumblebees, what we really want to know is how quick do they spread and how bad can it be? So, and then this was the sort of paper that kicked off a lot of this stuff by some colleagues of mine. But this was that one I said was really based on correlation, where they went to some greenhouses with commercial bees and said, these ones are sick, and those ones, they made all these other bees sick too, but without really empirically testing it. And I like empirical tests. So we asked these questions, which is how freely can pathogens move among commercial and wild bumblebee populations? And that was our primary question. We wanted to know, are the bumblebees passing stuff back and forth? We also want to know, is there a risk of movement between honeybees and bumblebees, which we know there's some risk, but we were interested in kind of putting some harder numbers to it. And then how far does that risk go? And by that I mean, actually how far out into the landscape from a commercial operation does that risk go? So to test these, we went down to Mona, and they have this greenhouse there. It's 11 hectares, which is about 25 acres, and it's one greenhouse building. So if you have not been down there, you can, if you're driving past Mona and you look off, heading south, and you look off to your right, there's a big power plant, and then right next to it, there's this big shiny glass-looking building, and that's their greenhouse. You can drive up there and drive up this dirt road and go right past it, and it's enormous. It's about 500 meters the long way and about 250 meters this way. So it covers a lot of ground. I've got a couple pictures here to show you, but when we decided we were going to do this, we said, well, we'll put two colonies of commercial bumblebees, the species Bombus impatiens, inside of there, and then we'll put a bunch outside. But what we realized was the distance between the inside and the outside, the 10-meter outside, was actually about 250 meters before you could get outside of the glass at all. So there's it's pretty enormous, and when you walk in there, it's just this forest of tomato plants as far as the eye can see. So it's a pretty cool spot. We put at these spots, so here we put bumblebees. They didn't want honeybees in there, and they didn't want wild honeybees. They wanted only commercial stuff that they bought and put in. So we played along with the Howlings folks, and we put bumblebees in here. We put bumblebees right outside the greenhouse, between 10 and 25 meters, as close as we could get them to the glass so that they weren't in the way, though. And then we went up the road 250 meters, and we stuck another, we put the bees here. Yeah, we had bumblebees at all these sites. We had feeding stations, and I'll explain those in a bit, at some of these sites as well. And then we looked at, there were two native western bumblebee hives at each of these locations outside, and then a sugar feeder station. So here's the sugar. This is Dr. Tripodi, and she's there setting up a feeding station. And we essentially invented these little artificial flowers, which are kind of cool. They're essentially a syringe, a 10 milliliter syringe that like you'd give a horse a shot with, except we fill them up with sugar water, and we hang them from these posts, and we put these yellow discs on, and we chose, this is just yellow craft foam from Michael's that we went and bought, and with a little bit of Velcro in the center. We cut a hole through it so the bees can land on that yellow. And we tried some experiments in the greenhouse, and the bees love this yellow color. We tried blue, we tried purple, nope, yellow. That was the one. They like, if bees are gonna craft, that's what they're using. And so they would come and they land on this and they grab a hold of that Velcro and they feed. You can watch them put their proboscis through the hole and into the feeder, and then they take a sip and then they fly off. So that's those guys. This is a bumblebee nest under a cafeteria tray. That was just to keep rain off. You can see it rains a lot in Mona, so we were worried about it. Not. And then we put honeybee nukes out. So we had honeybee nukes staged at various distances too. And these were all, the feeder and the bumblebees and the honeybees were all within a 10-meter circle. So the hard part was finding spots with enough shade that we didn't bake our bees instantly. And here's a close-up look at the artificial flower. You can see, if you look at this, you can see this very clearly from where you're sitting, I'm sure. So this is, the liquid in here is kind of blue. And the liquid, well, here's a good one. This is an up close. The liquid here is bright orange. So this is not accidental, and this is not spoilage. We put a fluorescent powder in each of these. And what that did was it marked that station. So the 250-meter station would always be the same color, and it would always have the same fluorescent powder. And here's the bumblebee, Bombus huntii, feeding on it right there, showing that it works. So here's our, oh yeah, and then this cool shot. This is under a black light. You can see in the nest, after they drink this syrup, they take this syrup with the fluorescent powder in and they fill these are, bumblebees put their honey in these honey pots, these nectar pots. And you can see under a black light, like the bees are going to a rave. Here it is, that shows up really bright. It's pretty neat. You can also see it actually will glint off of various body parts as well if they get any of that powder on themselves. And they'll actually take this fluorescent nectar and they'll use it when they build the wax in their colony. So they'll actually have weird little rings as they build these up. You'll see rings of different colors if you put different colors in at different times. You can do some weird stuff with them. It's pretty neat. So what we did was we went out and we had 4 different colored dyes. And we had bees, and so and we also had these 2 protein markers. So proteins are the dyes they're powders, so they dissolve. They don't really dissolve in the liquid; they're suspended in the liquid, kind of like the spore of, I don't know, foul brood or chalk brood. So some spore forming thing, right? So we took these as a proxy, the powders as a proxy for spores. But proteins are smaller particles, and proteins can move through the environment, what we thought much the way viruses can move through the environment. So we thought, well, we've got a good proxy in these pigments for spore-forming diseases, and the proteins, well, maybe kind of like viruses. So will these move similarly and give us an idea that hey, viruses are moving from one spot to another, or these powders, much like a spore, might move through the environment. So this was our way of doing this without taking diseased colonies out and dropping them next to this commercial greenhouse, which they wouldn't have been really excited about. The greenhouse that you're going to see in a second, they buy about 600 colonies of bumblebees a year to pollinate the tomatoes. So when you go to the grocery store in Utah and you see a little container of tomatoes and it says Howlings on it, those all come from that greenhouse. They sell almost exclusively in this state, and they're really the only greenhouse producer that's broadly selling in the state. So they are using a lot of bumblebees, and they did not want us to kill any of them if we could avoid it. So our setup was as such. Imagine this dashed line is the wall of the greenhouse. Inside of the greenhouse, we have some nests of bumblebees, and we take this protein. This protein in this case is a rabbit immunoglobulin protein. We spray it in sugar solution on the bees, and of course the bees groom each other, and it's all throughout their nest, and this protein gets in there. And those are marked with that protein. The bees in the nest are marked with protein. Then we set up one of those feeding stations of artificial flowers right next to those nests, and we put in these red pigments. So that's red. Right outside, just outside of the greenhouse, we spray the bumblebee nests with this chicken immunoglobulin. So a different protein, and we can tell the difference with these with a molecular test. And we set up a feeding station with orange dyed syrup. And then we go out 250 meters and we put up a feeding station, no dye, nothing special, just artificial flowers and a couple nests of bees. And we do that at 500 meters, except we do dye it green. And then at 750 meters, we don't put any dye in, but we put bees out. None of these bees over here are getting any of that protein. So these ones haven't been sprayed. And that's going to be important in a minute. And at 1,000 meters, so just over half a mile, 6/10 of a mile, we have a blue feeding station. And again, bees there. And we've got, like I said, a nuke of honeybees at these locations as well. So 2 bumblebee colonies and a honeybee nuke at each site, except inside. So we went back weekly for 6 weeks. Here's the roof of the greenhouse stretching out to the horizon. Here's our right outside feeding station. This is our 10-meter station, which is actually about 22 meters. So sorry, we couldn't be too accurate. We sampled workers from these hives. So each week we would go and we would take workers out of the bumblebee hives and out of the honeybee hives. And we were looking for, on those, we were looking for protein. And the powders, but mostly the protein. Was protein moving from one hive to another? So we knew the hives we treated with protein, and we treated only the same hives every week with the protein, and then we'd look at all the other hives for that protein to show up. So it wasn't moving. We also collected these fake flowers, so we'd pull these little discs off, and we put a new one on each week. And what we were looking for on those was protein and the powders. So was the powder from this feeding station moving to the other feeding stations, and was the protein from the hives we treated moving out onto the flowers? And then finally, we were also looking at the end of the experiment, we looked inside of all of the hives. We dissected the hives apart and looked for proteins and powders. So what was moving, where was it moving from, where did it move to, and how long did it take? So this is one of our flower discs under a black light. And obviously, there's a lot of green on here. The reason there's a lot of green on here is because it was at the green station. So we put it on that, there was we put the green dye in, and guess what? It showed up. And that's what you expect. You expect some of that syrup. The bees are there feeding all day long, blah, 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 blah. They're making messes, and then this ends up really green. But what's really cool is we have an orange fleck of orange fluorescence right here, or yellow rather, fluorescence right here. We have some more here. We have a red fluorescence up here this is on the yellow disc, this part around it. That's just the Velcro. And then we have some more red, and there's a few other splotches of red. So what we would do is we go every week and we look at all these discs. Okay, what moves? So there's some red here, that's a positive. Did we find blue? Did we find green? Did we find orange? And then we'd map that out. This is the front of a bumblebee nest. They have these entrances you can turn and lock them in or open so that they can forage. This is the yellow dye on the outside of one of the nests, so you can see where the bees were coming in and kind of slopping a little bit around, and they were leaving this powder on the outside of the nest. So that would be what we call a positive on the nest. So it's moving from a flower to the nest. So this is just right here. This is just the results from the bumblebee nest. So we sprayed chicken into the 2 nests here, and guess what? We found it in 100% of the nests we sprayed it into. What's interesting is we did not find the rabbit 100% of the time in the nest that we sprayed it into. So we think this was maybe a little less effective. And what was very interesting too is we did find the chicken had seemed to move into the greenhouse. So there's some chicken detection inside the greenhouse as well as outside. So that tells us that the bees from the nest inside and the bees from the nest outside are in some way transferring protein from one to the other. Whether they do that nest to nest or bee to flower to bee to nest, we're not sure, but there's movement happening here. The rabbit protein, interestingly, seems to move quite freely throughout the environment, but it's detected less frequently. And we're not sure why that is, but there's certainly movement going on. And then what's also interesting, this is the honeybee hives. We didn't spray protein into the honeybee hives, only into the bumblebees, but they're picking up that protein in the other nests. So the honeybees are getting this protein from the bumblebee somehow, whether they're going in and robbing it, or again, whether they're going bee to flower to be. We're not 100% sure, but right now we know that they are transferring some amount of this protein. Now I do have an alternative theory to why we're finding rabbit out here, because it seems odd to me that we wouldn't get 100% of the time in the nest we sprayed it in, but we're getting it at 1 kilometer. And if you've ever been to Mona and you've driven up on this road into the BLM land, you'll notice that it's prime jackrabbit habitat. And not only is it prime jackrabbit habitat, but where you have really good jackrabbit habitat, you have really good jackrabbit hunters. And a lot of these guys aren't apparently interested in the jackrabbits, just shooting them. So one thing we found right at this site, this 500-meter site, was a large pile of dead jackrabbits. And I'm not kidding. Like I gave this talk at a meeting a couple weeks ago, and one guy was like, I really liked your jackrabbit joke. And I'm like, no, there were dead jackrabbits all over the place. So I'm wondering if the bees out here aren't going out and somehow foraging, maybe they're just landing on the dead jackrabbits and bring it back in. I'm not sure. So these might be false positives. We don't know, but we really did not, when we set this up, anticipate the jackrabbit slaughter that was around us at the time. So I give this data with a little bit of caveat as far as the rabbit goes, that maybe the bumblebees are just really interested in jackrabbit carcasses. It's possible. But we do know that the chicken, there were no chicken slaughters. So we do know that the chicken was moving somehow from one to the other, and that makes me think that was good. So looking at the artificial flowers and looking at the dyes that may have moved, and again, the proteins, specifically we're going to focus on this chicken protein because we were confident that there was not contamination in the environment with chicken protein. But these are the flowers at the inside station, which was a bright orange dye, or a red dye rather. 100% of those flowers at the station had the dye. We would expect that. Same thing with the orange right outside. 100% of the flowers at that station had it. 100% of these green ones at the 500-meter station were detected. That's this one here I showed you before. And then the blue one out at 1,000 meters. Again, where we applied the dye, we found the dye, which is what you want. And what was also interesting was that when we looked at at remote sites, so this was right at the greenhouse site, and this is 250 meters out, about 5% of our artificial flowers had orange. So there was orange moving out onto the other flowers at 250, at 750, and at 1,000 meters. So bees were landing on these flowers, getting some of the orange, flying off, going to another flower, transferring orange, and we were seeing this transfer. At the same time, the nest that we sprayed the nest here with the chicken protein, and that chicken protein is moving out onto these flowers pretty freely. So about 10 to 15% of our flowers throughout the environment had chicken protein or rabbit protein on them. But again, I'm a little cautious about the rabbit. And then the other interesting thing we see is we see the bees. We don't see any of this dye from the inside flowers moving out of the greenhouse in this situation, but we certainly see some of this dye moving in, which is suggesting to me that the bees from inside the greenhouse are flying out, picking things up and bringing them back in, but the bees outside of the greenhouse aren't necessarily flying into the greenhouse to get resources. They're foraging on the landscape that's around them, at least here. So we feel pretty good, like, hey, the bees seem to be moving it. And what's really interesting when I talk about that time it takes is we saw movement of these dyes the full distance, the full 1,000 meters, within the first 2 weeks that things were out there. So things do spread, and they spread rapidly. So if you put a disease, what this tells me, you put a diseased hive out in the environment, and within 2 weeks, everybody within a kilometer circle around that has it, or at least has the chance to be exposed. So if you're like, nah, that foul brood will be good till next week, it'll be really good next week. So you need to think about that as you're managing your bees. I think this lesson from bumblebees sort of underscores the same thing. Your bees are going to be exposed to whatever your neighbor's got if he's close enough for your bees to share forage, and vice versa.